We're moving along now in our discussion of Moses, Joshua in the late Bronze Age, and we're going to deal mainly with Moses as we round out our discussion of the Pentateuch. And so I'm calling this Truth, the Bible in the Late Bronze Age, and we're going to look at what some of the interpretive payoffs are for our focus on this period. The biggest one is probably just simply the fact that the whole career of Moses takes place in the late Bronze Age. And Moses is the foundational character for the entire Old Testament, and especially with reference to the New Testament. Also then, the Exodus obviously takes place, Exodus 1 through 18, in the late Bronze Age. And we're going to ask the question, kind of an FAQ here, when did the Exodus happen? There's discussion about the dating of the Exodus in which people who believe in the Bible equally disagree about the dates. And so I want to take you through that. So I want to go straight to the question of when did the Exodus happen? Among people who take the Bible very seriously as a source for history, and yet who also understand the importance of interpreting the biblical statements, there are basically two candidates for the dating of the Exodus. There's one that is somewhat earlier, and there is one that is somewhat later. Now, you need to realize that people who have a different date for the Exodus are not the enemy. Okay? The people who are the enemy are people who don't believe an Exodus happened at all, so the whole date discussion is stupid. So if someone takes a somewhat earlier date, somewhat later date, you can have a discussion about that, a debate about that. But that's really not an adversarial point. And if you find somebody making an adversarial point out of that, remind them who the real opposition is. The real opposition are people who say that there ain't no Exodus and so it's stupid to try to assign a date to it. Now, these two discussions of the date of the Exodus have a similar logic. They start with a statement in the Bible itself about when the Exodus happened. Then they go looking for a peg outside of the Bible to hang that date to, and then they do the math and try to figure out when the Exodus happened. So the earlier date goes like this. It starts off looking easy. There's a biblical point of reference, 1 Kings 6:1. And in 1 Kings 6:1, we're told that the Temple of Solomon was dedicated 480 years after the Exodus. And so, obviously, if we know the date that Solomon's temple was dedicated, we add 480 because remember we're going back BC, and that should give us the date for the Exodus. Now, the text also tells us the temple is dedicated in the 4th year of Solomon. And so we do an interbiblical calculation here. 1 Kings 14:24-48, running forward, tells us that Pharaoh Shishak conducted a raid through Judah and Israel in the 5th year of Rehoboam. Rehoboam was Solomon's son. And so that would be the 5th year after Solomon's death, or the 45th year after Solomon came to the throne, or the 41st year after the temple was dedicated. You see where I'm going. The raid happens 41 years after the temple dedication. And so now we need an extra biblical anchor point for our calculation. Shishak's raid is described in a temple in Karnak in Egypt, and scholars have dated this raid to 926 BC. And so that tells us the temple was dedicated in 967, 966 BC. The reason for these slashes is their new year wasn't January 1st. They had 2 New Years, as a matter of fact, and so we sometimes use these slash numbers because there's a little bit of a slip depending on how you calculate the New Year. But that's not important. 967, 966 BC, the temple's dedicated. So, drum roll, we add 480 and come up with 1447 or 1446 BC for the Exodus. This makes Thutmose III or Amenhotep II pharaoh of the Exodus, depending on how you date their reigns. So that looks very simple, very easy, except there are some huge problems with this date, giant problems with this date. First of all, the numbers themselves. 480 is suspiciously 12 times 40, which suggests possibly it could be a thematic or a symbolic number. We also find in Chronicles that they calculate very carefully 12 generations of high priest between the Exodus and the temple, and they have to juggle some of the generations to get there. So that shows us that sometimes they tried to craft these numbers for a thematic purpose. Now, we don't automatically know that that's happened here, but that's just a possibility. It's just something that kind of goes bing in the back of your mind. Another problem are some inner biblical difficulties with the 480 years. And here we go. If you calculate all the years mentioned in the Bible between the Exodus and the dedication of the temple, here's what you get. There's 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. There's 5 years of conquest, according to Joshua 14:7 and 10. Then the time after the conquest until Joshua's death, we just call time X. We don't know how long that period was. Roughly from 10 to 45 years, but we really don't know how long that time was. I just put the 10 to 45 to give you an idea in the calculations what the range is. Then we're told that there were elders who outlived Joshua. We have no idea. There's no statement in the Bible how long that period lasted. Then we have the book of Judges, and between the judges Othniel and Samson, the book of Judges records a whopping 410 years have elapsed, an enormous number. Now, we don't know how long then from the death of Samson to the death of Eli, so that's period Z, and we really have no idea how long that lasted. However, Samson fought the Philistines, and they arrive in 1175. So somewhere from 1175 on to maybe 1100, 1050, this is when the Philistines get active. But we don't really know how long a period that was. Then from the death of Eli to the rise of David to the throne is about 13 years. And that's calculated by looking at the story of the ark and its captivity from the Philistines and its return. And then David reigns 7.5 years in Hebron, and then he reigns in Jerusalem, and he brings the ark up. And so we factor all that out, that from the death of Eli to the rise of David is 13 years. Then we'll give 40 years for David's reign, and Solomon's reign up to the temple, 4 years. This adds up to 511 years, plus our 3 unknown periods, X, Y, and Z. And so if you want to add the 45-year maximum for Joshua, it'd be 556 years plus these other 2 periods. But I really don't know how long there was after the conquest that Joshua continued to live. And so I prefer to say 511 years plus 3 unknown periods that could easily have added up to another 100 years. And so that's a problem with our number 480. Now, the important thing to realize, the biblical author could do this math just like you and me. I mean, they didn't have computers, but they could add. They knew how to do that. And so the biblical authors knew this chronological data and still said it's 480 years. That's what leads some people to believe the statement in 1 Kings 6:1 is thematic, because the authors had the same numbers in front of them that you and I have. They could do the math. It's not hard. And so yet they still give us a number that blatantly doesn't match the totals in our text. Surely they knew what they were doing. And so they're trying to say something maybe qualitatively about that time. Other problems, though, with this earlier date abound. First of all, we have a reference in the book of Exodus itself to the city of Ramses. Now, we know that city, and that city was only known by that name from about 1300 up to 1130 BC. Before that, it had no place called Ramses because there had been no pharaoh named Ramses. And then when Ramses I came to the throne, then we can start talking about a city called Ramses. And then when you have a series of about 10 pharaohs with the name Ramses, but as the last one fades, the city itself then falls into ruin. It's given a different name, and it's never known as Ramses again. So we have this city whose name nestles very tightly into a fairly brief period of 1300 to 1130. Joshua, we're told in the book of Joshua, destroyed very explicitly the city network in Canaan. Remember, Egypt administered Canaan through a series of cities where they appointed city rulers. And Joshua makes a very specific point that Joshua killed those kings. In Joshua 12, we get a list of 30 cities. And every one of them, it says Joshua got their king. And so it lists the city and then it says one king. So that administrative network is wrecked according to the book of Joshua. But when we look at the Amarna letters in the mid-1300s BC, this city network is kind of crazy and it's loaded with controversy, but it's fully operational. And they're sending letters to Pharaoh. They're getting letters back to Pharaoh. They're stabbing each other in the back. They're griping and complaining. They're doing what bureaucrats do. But clearly, that city network is operational in Canaan in the middle of the 1300s. We also discover that there is widespread urban destruction in Canaan starting about 1240 and running up to about 1175. But around 1400, which is when the Israelites would have entered Canaan under the early date, we just don't see a lot of urban destruction. In fact, we see almost none. And what we do see can be explained from other causes. So we don't have a lot of cities being attacked and burned in 1400, and yet we do have a lot of that somewhat later in the 1240 to 1175. Another important point is that Egypt actively campaigned in Canaan, and they occupied Canaan all the way up to 1150 BC. Egypt was really present in Canaan during those years. But there's no mention there's no mention by an Egyptian text of Israel before the 1200s. You'll remember the inscription by Merneptah in 1209 is the earliest mention of Israel by an extra-biblical source. No other Egyptian mentions Israel in Canaan before that time. And so if the Israelites had entered Canaan in 1400 and the Egyptians have campaigned in Canaan year after year after year in the intervening centuries, they mention the Apiru, they mention the Shasu, they mention all these other groups. They never mention the Israelites until Merneptah in 1209. Also, the book of Judges would have taken place during this period, and it mentions nothing about any Egyptian military action in Canaan. And yet we know that Egypt campaigned in Canaan regularly all the way up to about 1150 BC. And so most of the judges must have occurred after Egypt lost control of Canaan in about the 1150s BC. That is, it doesn't look like the book really knows much about Egypt or Canaan when it was under direct Egyptian administration. There's also an interesting archaeological fact. Archaeological surveys indicate that there is a population explosion that begins in the late 1200s, 1225, that bit. It goes up to about 1000 BC. Villages are popping up all over the hill country, brand new villages on sites never occupied before, and the population just burgeons. Whoever these people are, they breed like cats. They create villages that all look very similar. They build houses that are all very similar. They don't eat pork. They have certain kinds of pottery that are characteristic of all their settlements, and their numbers just blow up, kind of moving generally from east to west, and this continues going until about 1000 BC when it levels off. But we see no expansion of the population of Canaan in 1400 BC. And so it raises the question whether or not there's another option for the date of the Exodus. And in fact, scholars who believe the Bible, just like people who use the early date, scholars suggest another date for the Exodus that is increasingly now, or really is, the majority view among evangelical scholars. And that is, I call it the adjusted or somewhat later date for the Exodus. We begin with a biblical reference, except it comes from the other side, Exodus 12:40. Exodus 12:40 tells us that the Hebrews were in Egypt for 430 years before the Exodus. That is, when Jacob entered Egypt under a Pharaoh who was friendly to Northwest Semitic type people, let them come into the country. From that time, it was 430 years to the Exodus. And as I just said, it was during a period when Jacob entered Egypt when it was fairly easy for Northwest Semitic people to come into Egypt. Joseph was a high official serving, at the right hand of Pharaoh. And Joseph and the Israelites or the 70 family of Israel are invited into the country, and they're honored and they're appreciated. And so that leads us to an extra biblical anchor point, namely, when in Egypt's history would it have been easy for Northwest Semitic people to be welcomed into Egypt? And I'm not talking about rich merchants. I'm talking about shepherds, ordinary people. And the answer to that is that in the 13th dynasty of Egypt, there is an influx of Canaanites, and the 13th dynasty begins to collapse. And this will culminate in the rule of these kings that we refer to as the Hyksos kings, who might indeed be Northwest Semitic people themselves. And so if you subtract from roughly the 1700 to 1710, subtract the 1430, and you come up with the 1270s BC. Now, obviously, the period in which we have friendly pharaohs, a good time for Northwest Semites to migrate into Egypt, it's kind of a spongy time. We can't put an exact date on when that would be, but about 1700 is sufficient. So you subtract your 430, you come up with the 1270s BC. Now, on the other end, from Merneptah's inscription, we know that Israel is in Canaan by about 1209 BC. So when Merneptah comes to the throne, he's in his 60s. It's funny, I'm going to get to be a pharaoh even if I'm on Social Security when I do it. So he comes to the throne, and Merneptah is facing the first indications that the glory of the late Bronze Age is about to pass. He starts facing invaders from Libya, invaders from islands out in the sea. He starts facing all sorts of things nibbling on the edges of Egypt's empire. And one of the groups that Merneptah fights is Israel. So this is Merneptah bashing some of his enemies. And you might say, Merneptah, pick on somebody your own size. And he would say, why? I can beat these little guys up so much more easily. He rules from 1212 to 1202, and he conducts a brutal campaign in Canaan shortly after becoming pharaoh. And that would be, of course, following the Israelites' arrival. And he actually mentions Israel in his victory inscription. And so let me show you that inscription here. It's called the Merneptah Stela. And he campaigns in 1209, and he writes it up on this stela. And I mean, check out the headgear of those guys there in the middle at the top. I mean, it's like the original cone heads. But the inscription in the relevant place reads, all the rulers are prostrate, saying peace. None among the 9 bows dare raise his head. The 9 bows is Egypt's traditional name for all of its enemies. Plundered is Libya. Hatti, that's the Hittites, is at peace. Devastated is Canaan with every evil. Carried off is Ashkelon. Gezer is taken. Yanoam is nothing. And then the crucial line, Israel is laid waste, having no seed. Huru is a widow because of Egypt. All the lands together are now at peace because they're all dead, and all who roamed have been subdued. So this is what the name of Israel looks like in Egyptian hieroglyphic. And the important thing is that this is the earliest certain reference to Israel outside the Bible in 1209 BC. And the interesting thing about this reference is they are flagged in this text not as a territory or as a nation. They are flagged as a people group. And that's very important. They appear in the eyes of Merneptah not to be linked to cities, not to be just linked to a territory, but rather they are a people group. Now, Israel had to have been formidable on some level. They had to be worth fighting. They had to be worth mentioning, and claiming to have wiped them out had to be a claim that Merneptah could be proud of. Because, he wouldn't say, I ran over a bug with my chariot and it went splat. I mean, if Israel was insignificant, he wouldn't have bothered to mention them. So Israel must have been formidable, and yet, on the other hand, Israel is not to the place yet where they have conferred their name on the territory in which they live. So it looks like Israel is still kind of in formation there in Canaan. And so if you add 40 years to that, that gives you the 1240s then as the latest possible date in which the Exodus could have taken place. Ramses II then becomes, of necessity, the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Ramses II rules from 1279 to 1213, and so his career fits exactly in this spot. In addition, Exodus 2:23 tells us that the Exodus happened under a new Pharaoh. At the end of Exodus 2, it says, "In those days, the king of Egypt died." And at that point, God heard the cry of his people, called Moses, and sent Moses to Egypt, and prompted then the Exodus to begin. And so that suggests that Moses is confronting a newly crowned Pharaoh in the stories that we see in the book of Exodus. And so that again would be Ramses. Ramses comes to the throne in 1279, and any time in those first 4 or 5 years would be fine as a period when Moses could confront him. And also, think about this. Moses is this old fossil. He's like 80 or something. Ramses is in his late teens or early 20s. And he's this young guy. Give up the stuff that you see like in Prince of Egypt where Moses and Ramses are like pranking the priests together, and they weren't peers. Ramses would have never had any contact with Moses, might have known him by reputation, but probably never heard of him. So when Moses comes, lurching out of the desert, this sand-covered 80-year-old, guy, this is for Ramses like somebody that he has absolutely no real interest in whatsoever. So anyway, we also know that Ramses campaigns, or at least maneuvers, near Jericho around 1271. So Ramses campaigns in Canaan in 1275. He fights off, has the battle with the Hittites up at Kadesh about that same time. And then about 1271, Ramses and his oldest son are maneuvering in force in the vicinity of Jericho for reasons that are not entirely clear. So Ramses then becomes the candidate for the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and Merneptah in 1209 to 1207 or so still sees Israel as a decentralized people, suggesting a somewhat recent arrival perhaps for the Israelites. If the Israelites had already been there for 200 years, it's hard to imagine that Merneptah would have seen them as a decentralized people with no local centers or anything. So there must have been a recent arrival. And so that places the Exodus somewhere in the first few years of Ramses II, 1279 to 1275. If we take the 40 years wilderness wandering at face value, we have the entry into Canaan then happening about 1240 to 1235. So that's the somewhat adjusted date. And this is a date also that fits with the large number of urban destructions in Canaan around the 1230s on up to the turn of the era. That also fits in with that population explosion that we see in the highlands. That's incoming Israelites settling. So there are a lot of other things archaeologically that fit better with this somewhat later date for the Exodus.